The departure board above Gate C32 at Fiumicino Airport still showed my flight to New York as boarding when my daughter walked away and didn't look back. I stood there with my carry-on bag beside me and my boarding pass in my hand, watching Sofia move through the crowd. She had her husband Damiano's arm and her new luggage and the precise, deliberate walk of someone who has made a decision and refuses to second-guess it. The terminal noise swallowed her up, the announcement cycling through Italian, English, French, the rolling of wheels across polished floors, the particular white noise of 10,000 people going somewhere, and then she was gone through the glass, down the corridor toward Gate B7, taking my grandchildren with her. I sat down in one of the hard plastic chairs near the window. A woman 2 rows across was feeding crackers to a toddler who kept dropping them and looking surprised each time. A businessman in a rumpled suit had fallen asleep with his mouth open, his tie loosened, his laptop balanced on his stomach. The gate agent was making her final call in Italian. I understood her perfectly. 34 years of marriage to an Italian man will do that to you. I did not move toward the gate. I was 68 years old, sitting alone in an airport in Rome, watching my flight close its doors, and the thing that surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not numb. Not in shock. Calm, the particular calm that arrives when something you have been quietly dreading for a long time finally shows itself completely, and you realize the anticipation was worse than the thing itself. Sofia had left me here because I had said no. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. That was all it had taken. 1 word, 2 letters, and my daughter, who had been born in a hospital in New Haven on a Tuesday morning in March, while outside the window it was snowing sideways, and I had held Enzo's hand until I could feel his bones shift, who I had watched learn to walk and read and drive and fall in love and stand at an altar in a dress I had helped her choose, had picked up her bag and walked away from me in a terminal and boarded a plane without me on it. She had said, before she left, that I was being unreasonable, that I was punishing her for asking a completely legitimate question about the future of a property that would come to her eventually anyway, that I was bitter and closed-minded, and then very quietly, looking me directly in the face, that her father would have been ashamed of me. She knew exactly where to put that particular knife. But she was wrong about the last part. I know this because I knew Enzo Marino for 37 years, lived beside him and argued with him and loved him and held his hand through the final year of his illness, and I know what he would have thought about everything that had happened since he died. He would have thought what I had been thinking for the last 2 years, since I first started to understand clearly what Sofia and Damiano were actually doing. He would have said, "Margarita, you have been too patient for too long. My name is Margaret Thornton Marino. I was born in Greenwich, Connecticut, to a furniture restorer father and a school librarian mother, and I spent most of my 20s in Florence working as an apprentice art conservator at a small private atelier that specialized in panel paintings and tempera. It was meticulous, painstaking work that required a particular combination of technical knowledge, physical steadiness, and the patience to learn from a surface before you touched it. I was good at it. I am still good at it. In the consulting capacity I maintain now, advising museums and private collectors on restoration approaches, reviewing condition reports, occasionally overseeing a particularly complex treatment. It was in that Florence atelier in 1985 that I met Enzo. He was the youngest son of an old Florentine family that had been dealing in antiques since the 1890s, and he came into the workshop with the absolute certainty of a man who has never seriously considered that he might not be welcome somewhere. He stood for a long time looking at the 15th century Madonna. I was cleaning a delicate, damaged thing that had come in from a private collection in Lucca, without saying a word. Then he said in Italian, "You have very steady hands for someone so young." I told him, also in Italian, that steady hands were a professional requirement and that complimenting a woman on her hands was a strange opening. He laughed so hard he knocked a jar of solvent off the edge of a work table. We were married 18 months later, in a church outside Florence, with 60 of his family's relatives and my parents flown in from Connecticut looking slightly stunned by the scale of the thing. My mother told me afterward that the food alone had convinced her the marriage was a good idea. Sofia came 4 years after that, born in the United States because I had wanted my daughter to have an American birth certificate and the option of dual citizenship. Enzo agreed to this the way he agreed to everything I asked in those months, with uncomplicated, complete enthusiasm, because I was carrying his child and he was besotted, and that was simply the shape of the man he was. It was the same quality in him that I loved most deeply. That total, unambiguous devotion to the people he had chosen to love. We split our time in Sofia's early years between Florence and New Haven, where I had taken a teaching position. Enzo managed the American side of his family's business, consulting on acquisitions, brokering antique pieces for private collectors on the East Coast, occasionally traveling to estate sales in houses that smelled of old money and older books. He was extraordinarily good at it. He had an eye for authenticity that bordered on the uncanny, and a social ease that made wealthy clients feel seen rather than merely sold to. Sofia grew up between two languages and two countries and never seemed entirely at home in either. She was a restless child, always wanting the thing that was elsewhere. In Florence, she wanted American breakfast cereal and Saturday cartoons, and the particular casualness of her New Haven schoolmates. In Connecticut, she wanted the Italian cousins and the long summer evenings and the way her grandmother made pasta on Sunday mornings with her sleeves pushed up and flour to her elbows. I understood the difficulty of it. Being between two worlds is genuinely hard for a child. You spend your whole childhood feeling slightly like a guest, and that is no small thing. I had felt it myself when I first arrived in Florence at 23, and I had found my footing eventually, but it had taken years and some real heartbreaks along the way. What I did not fully understand until it was too late to course correct was that Sofia had developed a different response to that rootlessness than I had. I had responded by working harder, building competence, making myself someone who didn't depend on belonging anywhere in particular. Sofia had responded by wanting to own things, to have her name on things, to claim by possession what had always felt borrowed. The villa first entered our lives properly when Enzo's mother died in 2003. Giovanna Marino had owned a working property in the hills south of Siena, 15 acres of olive groves, a walled garden that had been a garden since the 15th century, and a farmhouse that had been extended and refined over generations until it had become something genuinely extraordinary. Stone floors worn smooth by centuries of feet, painted ceiling beams in the main sala, a kitchen that caught the afternoon light in a particular golden dust way that made you want to stand in it and do nothing whatsoever. Giovanna left it to Enzo outright, bypassing his older brother, which was unusual and caused an extended period of family unpleasantness. But Giovanna had always been a woman who made her own decisions, and she had decided that of all her children, Enzo was the one who would care for the property the way it deserved to be cared for. She was correct. He spent the first 2 years after her death restoring the farmhouse roof, replanting the section of olive grove that had gone to scrub, repointing the stone walls around the walled garden. He did it all with the same patient attention he brought to everything. He was not a man who did things in a hurry, and the result showed. Sofia was 23 when her grandmother left us the villa. She visited that first summer with a boyfriend from Boston whose main distinguishing characteristic was that he never once asked a question about anything around him, and she spent the week swimming in the pool Enzo had put in and sunbathing on the terrace and telling people back home that her family had this incredible property in Tuscany. Enzo noticed the phrasing "her family's property," "her family's villa," and said nothing to Sofia about it. He said something to me one evening when we were sitting on that terrace ourselves, watching the fireflies rise out of the olive trees. "She thinks of it as hers already," he said. "She's young," I said. "She'll learn the difference between what's yours and what you love." He looked at me in the particular way he had, level, and a little sorrowful. "Let's hope so." He died in 2019, after 16 months of a pancreatic cancer that had appeared out of nowhere during a routine checkup on an ordinary Tuesday. He was 71. We had been married 34 years. He left everything to me. The Florence apartment, the business interests, the accounts, the villa. He did it through an Italian notarial will that was absolutely unambiguous. I know this because I had our lawyer review it twice in the months after he died, when I was still in the fog of grief and needed the anchor of certainty. Everything was in order. Everything was mine. Sofia called 2 weeks after the funeral, when she had recovered enough from her own grief to think about practical matters, and said she and Damiano wanted to bring the children to the villa for August. For the healing. For Marco and Lucia, who needed their grandmother in the space and the pool and the particular way children expand into a property like that. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was 65 years old and had just buried my husband, and my grandchildren needed me, and the villa needed people moving through it. I said yes, and I meant it without reservation. That was where the slow things started. They came for 3 weeks. Sofia moved through the villa the way she always had, with the ease of someone who has never seriously considered that she might need permission. She reorganized the kitchen cupboards without mentioning it. She replaced the guest room linen with a set she'd ordered online, delivered to the villa address in her name. She redirected the standing olive oil delivery from a local producer Enzo had used for 20 years to her name on the account. Small adjustments. The sort that, taken individually, you could attribute to helpfulness or habit. Damiano had recently discovered golf and talked about property constantly. He was interested in what parcels near the villa were selling for, what buyers from Milan and Germany and England were paying, what a renovation of the farmhouse into something with more contemporary amenities might yield on the luxury rental market. He talked about these things the way people talk about weather, casually, continually, as though the conversation were simply ongoing rather than being steered somewhere specific. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, he would open a bottle from Enzo's cellar, and they would sit with me on the terrace and talk about the future. Their future. The children's future. How wonderful it would be for Marco and Lucia to grow up knowing this place. How important it was that the property stayed in the family rather than being sold off to foreign buyers the way so much of Tuscany had been. How sad it would be if some pressure, financial, practical, the difficulties of elderly property management eventually forced difficult decisions. I never said anything that encouraged this. But I also never said anything that closed it down, and Sofia interpreted my silence the way she always had, as tacit agreement, or at least as an absence of objection. She had been doing this for most of her adult life because I had for too long let her. They came back the following August. And the one after that. Each visit was longer. Each time, Damiano arrived with more specific information about the surrounding property market, more detailed opinions about renovation potential, more familiarity with the local planning regulations. Each time, Sofia made more decisions without raising them with me, first hiring the cleaning company herself and setting up a direct payment arrangement, ordering repairs to the pool pump under her name, having herself added to the mailing list of the local town council's planning committee updates. The third summer, they brought friends from Milan, a couple who had recently purchased a farmhouse in the next valley, and were converting it to a luxury bed and breakfast. They stayed for a long weekend. Damiano talked business with the husband in the garden. Sofia took the wife on a tour of the property. I was in the kitchen making lunch. I could hear them through the open window. The stone on the terraces is original, Sofia was saying. Some of it's 16th century. Damiano thinks if we added guest suites in the east wing and modernized the kitchen not completely, you'd want to keep the character. We could charge €4,000 a night, maybe more in season. You're planning to do that? The wife asked. A small pause before Sofia answered. Eventually, when things are settled. I put down the bread knife and stood at the counter for a moment, looking out through the window at the garden. The light was doing the thing it does in that kitchen in the afternoon, falling in through the west-facing windows at an angle that turned everything it touched to gold. Enzo's mother had loved that kitchen in the afternoon. Enzo had loved it. I have loved it for 30 years. Then I picked up the bread knife and finished what I was doing. I want to be clear about something because it matters enormously for what came later. I am not a naive woman. I was not, in those years, failing to understand what was happening around me. I understood it very precisely. What I was doing was something different, watching, carefully and without urgency, waiting to see how far the thing would go before I acted. It is a habit from conservation work. You look at a damaged painting for a long time before you touch it. You learn everything the surface can tell you. You understand the nature and extent of the deterioration before you decide what the repair requires. Enzo used to call it a conservator's patience. He meant it as a compliment. He also occasionally said it unnerved him. Promise me, he said to me once in the last year of his life, when we were talking about Sofia in the oblique way we always talked about Sofia, never directly, always coming at it from the side. Promise me you will not wait until there is nothing left to save. I had told him there was always something left to save. He had looked at me in that particular way of his, and said nothing more. The formal proposal came in the spring of the 4th year after his death. Sofia called on a Sunday morning. I was in the Florence apartment, had been at a museum the previous afternoon consulting on a restoration project, and said she and Damiano needed to talk about something important. Could I come to Rome? They were there for the month. I drove down. The autostrada from Florence to Rome cuts through the kind of landscape that makes you understand why people have always been willing to fight over pieces of it: the big skies over the Val di Chiana, the hills going purple in the late afternoon, the long run south through Lazio. I played a Schubert piano trio that Enzo had loved, and I drove and I thought about what the conversation would be. Sofia and Damiano's apartment near Prati was beautiful, a high floor with a view of the Vatican Dome, and a kitchen that had been recently renovated. Sofia made a proper lunch. She is a good cook. She learned from me, using Enzo's mother's recipes, when she was in her mid-20s. After the children went for their afternoon rest, Damiano brought out a folder. I had known there would be a folder. Inside it was a 12-page proposal, professionally formatted, for converting the villa into a boutique agriturismo. 6 guest rooms, a restaurant built around the estate's own olive oil, and a seasonal menu sourced from local producers. A swimming pool renovation. A new access road from the lower gate. The projected renovation costs came to €820,000. The projected annual revenue, at occupancy rates the document described as conservative, was presented as more than sufficient to service the debt and generate profit within 4 years. The financing structure called for a bank loan secured against the villa property, supplemented by private investment from Damiano's business network. Throughout the 12 pages, the villa was referred to as the family property. Damiano walked me through it with the practiced fluency of someone who has sold many things to many people. He was smooth and thorough. Sofia sat beside him and watched my face. "What we'd need from you," she said when he finished, "is to transfer the deed into a joint structure. A family holding company, essentially. You'd retain a meaningful share. But for the bank to approve the loan against the property, the legal ownership needs to be properly structured around the entity." I looked at my daughter across their beautiful Roman table. "The deed is currently in my name alone," I said. "I know, Mama. That's what we're asking to change." "Why would I do that?" Her expression moved through something complicated. She has her father's coloring, dark hair, dark eyes, but she has never had his patience. Because this is the future of the property. Because it gives the villa a purpose. Because Papa would have wanted— "No," I said. A very quiet word. 2 letters. Damiano shifted in his chair. "Margaret, this doesn't need to be decided today. We'd want you to review everything with your own advisors, naturally, and we can refine the structure in whatever way." "I know what you're asking," I said. "And the answer is no." The lunch after that was extremely polite and entirely empty. I drove back to Florence in the early evening with the windows down and Schubert on again, watching the light change over the Apennines. In the weeks that followed, Sofia called with regularity. The calls started as questions and reframings. Perhaps the structure could be arranged differently. Perhaps I didn't need to transfer the deed outright. Perhaps a power of attorney was all that was really required, just enough of a legal mechanism for the project to move forward. Each version was slightly different from the last. Each version was still asking for something I was not willing to give. In between those calls, I was doing something that I had not told Sofia about. I had been meeting with Francesca Gentili, my notary in Florence. Francesca had handled Enzo's legal affairs for the last 15 years of his life, and continues to handle mine. She is small and precise and absolutely reliable, and Enzo trusted her completely, which was recommendation enough for me. Over 3 months of meetings, careful, thorough, unhurried meetings in her office on the Via Tornabuoni, I had asked her to prepare several things. A new will, replacing the one I had written in the first year after Enzo died, which had left everything to Sofia as a matter of course. A charitable trust structure for the villa, establishing it as a foundation dedicated to the preservation of the property and the maintenance of traditional Tuscan agricultural practice. A foundation of which I would be the sole trustee for my lifetime, and of which, after my death, the board would consist of 3 appointed members from the conservation and restoration community, not one of them named Russo. A clause within that trust granting right of use to direct descendants because I was not cruel, and because Marco and Lucia deserved to know their grandparents' house. But use was not ownership. Loving something was not the same as owning it. Francesca had looked at me across her desk and said, "Sofia won't be pleased." "Sofia won't know," I said, "until it is necessary for her to know." Francesca had nodded once and reached for her pen. When Sofia proposed the trip to the villa, a family holiday in July, no business conversations, just time together, I agreed. I agreed because my grandchildren were not responsible for any of this and I missed them, and because I had not been to the villa since the previous autumn, and because I had spent the previous 3 months in Francesca's office building something that could not be undone, and I wanted, before any of it became necessary, to see how things stood. I arrived at the villa on a Sunday. I drove from Florence with 2 suitcases and a box of books, and when I walked through the front door, the house smelled the way it has always smelled: old stone and lavender and the dry sweetness of olive wood smoke absorbed into the walls over centuries. I walked through the room slowly. I stood in the kitchen in the afternoon light for a while. Sofia and Damiano arrived the next morning with the children and a monumental amount of luggage, and a new golden retriever named Oscar, who ate one of my garden shoes within 10 minutes of arrival. The first week was genuinely good. Beautiful even. Marco and Lucia were in the pool by 7 every morning. We had long lunches under the pergola and walked down to the village in the evenings. Damiano grilled things with great enthusiasm. One morning Sofia and I made bread together using Giovanna's recipe side by side at the kitchen counter, flour on both our forearms, without saying anything particularly significant, and for an hour it felt like none of the rest of it existed. But then toward the end of the second week, a new folder appeared. Not the same folder as the one in Rome. Updated numbers, revised timeline, different language throughout, but the same essential request. The villa. The deed. The structure. Damiano presented it after dinner when the children were in bed, with less formality than before, more like a son-in-law raising a reasonable concern at the end of a long day. The investors have been patient, he said. But September is really, Damiano, I said. I appreciate the update. Mama. Sofia's voice was carefully measured. She had the look she gets when she's deciding exactly how hard to push. We can't keep putting this off. The window doesn't stay open indefinitely. My answer hasn't changed. Why are you doing this? The carefulness had left her voice completely. Underneath it was something rawer and less controlled. Is this punishment? Because of the things I said when we first raised the proposal. It's not punishment, I said. It's my answer. It's Papa's property, she said. It belongs to the family. It was Papa's property. Now it is mine. He left it to me. Because he trusted you to, she stopped. Restarted. Because he trusted you to hold it for the family. He trusted me to care for it, I said. Full stop. The argument that followed was the worst one we had had in 4 years of difficult conversations. Damiano took himself to the terrace with a glass of wine, which was wise of him. Sofia said things she had clearly been storing for a long time, that I had always made her feel like a guest in her own family's places, that Enzo had loved her too and it wasn't right or fair that everything had passed only to me, that I was being spiteful and self-centered and had stopped understanding what family actually meant, that I had always put my work and my own concerns first and she had felt it her whole life. I sat and let her say all of it. I have learned over many years that some things need to come out fully before they can be put down. When she had said everything she had to say, I said, "You are my daughter and I love you. But this conversation is over for tonight." She went to bed without another word. The last 3 days of the holiday were cold in the way that is worse than outright conflict, polite surfaces with nothing moving underneath. Damiano was careful. The children sensed the atmosphere and became quiet and strange, staying close to whichever adult seemed most available. On the final morning, loading the cars for the drive to Rome, Sofia came to find me in the garden. She looked like she hadn't slept properly in days. She was holding something, a document folded. "Before we go," she said, "I need you to sign this." I took it and read it. A notarized power of attorney over the villa, prepared by an Italian lawyer whose name I didn't recognize, granting Damiano Russo full authority to act on the property's behalf in all legal and commercial matters. I folded it along its existing crease and held it back out to her. "No," I said. "Mama." "No, Sofia." She put it in her bag. Her jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle working. "Fine," she said. "Then we're done discussing it." I thought she meant for that morning. I thought we would drive to Rome and there would be the exhausted, fragile peace that comes after a sustained argument has run its course, and we would go to the airport and I would hug Marco and Lucia for a long time and get on my plane and call my old college roommate from the lounge somewhere over the Atlantic. I was not thinking clearly about what kind of woman my daughter had become. We arrived at Fiumicino with 4 hours before my flight, because Sofia and Damiano had an earlier departure, and had arranged us all on the same car transfer from Rome. Check-in was straightforward. Security took time. We had coffee in the departures hall and the children had granitas, and for a little while it was almost ordinary. Marco telling me about his football team's season, Lucia showing me something she'd drawn on the drive, the particular sweetness of grandchildren who don't yet know that the adults around them are not all right. Then we walked together toward the gates, and at a junction in the main terminal where the departure board split B concourse on one side, C on the other, Sofia stopped. "We'll say goodbye here," she said. I looked at her. Damiano was just behind her, looking at his phone. Marco and Lucia had their earbuds in and were sharing a screen. "My gate is C32, I said. "It's in the other direction." "I know," Sofia said. "That's what I mean. We're going this way." A small cold thing moved through me. "Come with me to my gate," I said. "Say goodbye properly. Bring the children." "Mama." Her voice was completely flat, and I understood suddenly that she had decided this before we left the villa, perhaps before we left Rome, perhaps before the final morning in the garden. "We've said what there is to say. Sofia." I looked at her carefully. I tried to find in her face the woman who had stood beside me at the kitchen counter making bread with flour on her arms. I could not find her. What I found was someone who had already gone somewhere else in her mind, someone who had decided that this was a price worth paying for a point she needed to make. "Come and say goodbye to me at my gate." She didn't move. "If you're going to keep that property from your own family," she said in a low, measured voice that she had clearly rehearsed, "then you can find your own way to your gate." She turned and walked down the B concourse and Damiano followed her without looking at me, and the children went with them, Marco turning to give me one confused, uncertain backward look that did something small and specific to my chest. I stood at the junction for a moment, long enough for the three of them and my grandchildren to disappear around the first bend in the corridor. Then I walked to C32. The gate was crowded when I arrived. I found a seat near the window and set my bag between my feet and looked out at the runway. The afternoon light was falling across the tarmac in long gold bars, the same light as the villa kitchen, the same light as everywhere in this country in summer in the late afternoon. It was Enzo's light. It had always been Enzo's light. I thought about calling Francesca. I thought about calling my old colleague in Florence, who had known Enzo for 30 years and would have had something useful to say. I thought about calling my roommate in New York, a woman named Patricia who had known me since we were 18, and who would have said exactly the right things in exactly the right order. Called no one. I sat with my boarding pass and I held it, and I thought for a long time about the document Sofia had brought to the garden that morning. The power of attorney prepared by a lawyer whose name I didn't recognize. The investor timeline that closed in September. The 12 pages in the Rome folder. The summers of reorganized cupboards and redirected deliveries, and whispered conversations about what a renovation might yield. And I thought about something else. Something I had not told anyone. 3 days before we had left for Rome, while Sofia and Damiano were at the village market with the children, and the villa was quiet, I had gone to the study. Enzo's study. The room with his desk, an old chestnut piece his father had used before him, scarred in specific places from decades of work, and stacked with the particular clutter of a man who had known where everything was. In the second drawer on the left, I had put a letter 6 months earlier. I had put it there because the villa was where it belonged, in that desk, in that specific drawer where Enzo had kept things he considered genuinely important. The letter was addressed to Sofia. I had written it myself in the careful, deliberate way I write everything that matters. It explained what I had done with Francesca, the trust, the foundation, the new will, the structure that meant the villa could not be sold, could not be mortgaged, could not be converted into a boutique agriturismo or any other commercial venture. Not by Sofia, not by Damiano, not by anyone acting on their behalf or their instruction. It explained the right of use, the clause I had specifically included so that Marco and Lucia would always be able to come here, so that their children would know it, so that the family could love the place without owning it, which is what loving something actually means. I had not left the letter for Sofia to find accidentally. I had left it there because I had imagined, when the time came, going back to the villa with her, sitting together in that study, explaining it all face to face. But Sofia had made a different timeline. She had walked away from me at a gate junction in Fiumicino, and I was sitting in a plastic chair watching my boarding pass, and the gate was closing. And somewhere across this terminal my daughter was settling into her seat on a plane, believing she had levied a punishment that would cost me enough to make me reconsider. She believed I was almost certain that I would call that night or tomorrow morning, that the humiliation of being left alone in an airport would shift my calculation, that she had correctly identified the thing I would not be willing to pay. She did not understand that she had just done something that couldn't be undone. I had spent 4 years watching and waiting. I had made my arrangements quietly and carefully, the way you make arrangements when you are working with something valuable and irreplaceable, the way Giovanna Marino had made her own arrangements when she looked at all her children and chose the one who would actually care for what she loved. The gate agent made her final boarding call. I picked up my bag. There were things Sofia did not know, sitting on her plane across this terminal. She did not know about the letter in the desk. She did not know about the foundation, the trust, the new will. She did not know that I had not been passive in those 4 years, that I had been watching and thinking and building something she couldn't reach. And she did not know the thing I had decided, sitting in that plastic chair watching the runway gold. I was not going to New York. I was going to walk back to the main ticketing hall and change my flight, and then I was going to drive back to Florence, and then I was going to drive to Siena, and then I was going to go back to the villa and sit at Enzo's desk in the late evening with the doors open and the fireflies coming up out of the olive trees, and I was going to call Francesca. I was going to tell her I was ready to move forward with everything. All of it. Every step. Every consequence. Sofia had asked me at that Roman lunch table over a year ago whether I understood anymore what it meant to have a family. I understood exactly what it meant. I had built one with Enzo for 34 years and raised my daughter in it, and watched, over the 4 years since his death, as she had come to treat it as an inventory, things to be claimed, things to be structured, things to be leveraged. And I had been patient about it for longer than I should have been, longer than Enzo would have been, longer certainly than his mother Giovanna would have been. But I was done being patient. I handed my boarding pass to the gate agent. She scanned it. The machine beeped. "Actually," I said, "I've changed my mind about this flight." She looked up from the scanner. "I need to speak with someone at the main ticketing counter," I said. "I won't be boarding today." She blinked. "Signora, it's the final call." "I know," I said. "Thank you." I picked up my carry-on and walked away from Gate C32 in the direction of the main hall, and I did not look back. Sofia had walked away from me without looking back. I had learned something useful watching her do it. I had learned that it was not, in fact, difficult when you knew exactly where you were going. The ticketing agent at the main counter was a young man with the particular exhausted patience of someone 3 hours from the end of a long shift. He looked at my boarding pass, at my passport, at his screen, and then back at me with the expression of someone who processes unusual requests often enough to have stopped being surprised by them. "You'd like to cancel your New York booking," he said. "And book a flight to Florence," I said. "The next available one." He typed for a moment. "There's a Fiumicino to Florence service departing at 1840. That's in about 2 hours. "That's fine." He looked at me one more time, a quick, involuntary look, the kind you give someone when you are trying to understand what has happened to them without asking. I was 68 years old, and I was standing at an airport counter in a linen travel jacket with a carry-on bag, and the particular stillness of someone who has made an irreversible decision and is at peace with it. "Of course, signora," he said, and began the change. While he processed it, I bought a coffee from a cart nearby and stood at a window overlooking the aprons, watching the planes move in the heavy July light. Somewhere in this airport, Sofia and Damiano and my grandchildren were boarding their flight. Marco had turned back to look at me in the corridor. That look had done the thing to my chest that I mentioned before, and it was still there, a specific, precise ache that I suspected would take some time to go away. But I had made a mistake in the weeks and months of those difficult conversations with Sofia, of conflating the pain of a situation with the wrongness of my position. The fact that something hurts does not mean you are doing the wrong thing. Enzo had understood this. He had watched his brother's face at his mother's funeral, when the will was read, and he had held his grief for his brother's hurt without for one moment doubting what their mother had decided. "Your flight is confirmed," the young man said behind me. I turned back to the counter, collected my new boarding pass, and thanked him. The 2 hours passed in a departure lounge with decent coffee and a view of the runways. I sat and read. Or rather, I sat with a book open and thought about the drive that was coming and the villa that was waiting at the end of it, and the desk drawer with the letter inside it that I had put there 6 months ago. For a moment I hadn't known would look quite like this. The Florence flight was 45 minutes. I took a taxi directly to where I had left my car at a parking facility near the airport rather than the long-term lot I normally used, because something in me had known, when I'd parked it 3 weeks ago before driving south to join the family in Rome, that I might want to leave Florence with less delay than a shuttle bus would allow. I stopped for petrol and a bottle of water on the outskirts of Florence, and then I drove south. The drive from Florence to the villa, on the back roads rather than the autostrada, takes just under 2 hours on a clear evening. It goes through the Chianti Hills and then down through the Crete Senesi, that particular landscape that looks like it was painted by someone working from memory of something perfect, the rolling clay hills, the single cypress trees on the crests, the light going amber and then red as it drops behind the western ridge. I have made that drive hundreds of times. I will never get used to it. I arrived at the villa just before 9. The summer evening was still light at the edges, the sky the deep blue that comes just before dark in Tuscany in July, and the house sat in it looking exactly as it always looks, solid and old and entirely itself, with the lights off and the garden silent except for the cicadas and a soft movement in the olive trees from a breeze coming down from the hillside. I unlocked the front door and stood in the entrance for a moment, letting the house settle around me. There is a particular quality to the silence of a house that has been full of family and has just been emptied. It is not an unpleasant silence. It is more like the silence after music, a presence of something recently there, still reverberating in the walls. I could feel Marco and Lucia in it. The pool still smelling faintly of sunscreen. A drawing Lucia had done of the garden, left on the kitchen table, which I picked up and set carefully on the windowsill. I put down my bag. I opened the kitchen doors to the terrace and stood there for a while, looking out at the olive grove going dark, listening to the nightjars beginning their calls in the valley below. Then I went to Enzo's study. The room is at the back of the house, off the main corridor, with a window that faces east toward the hills and catches the morning light. It smells of old paper and linseed oil and something I have never been able to name specifically, something particular to that room, to that desk, that I associate entirely with Enzo and with the sense of things being attended to carefully. I sat at the desk and opened the second drawer on the left. The letter was where I had put it, in a cream envelope with Sofia's name on the front in my handwriting. I took it out and held it for a moment without opening it. I had written it in February, over 2 evenings at this desk, and I had read it back twice before I sealed it. I knew what it said. I put it back in the drawer, but I didn't close the drawer all the way. Then I took out my phone and called Francesca. She answered on the third ring, which for Francesca at 9 in the evening meant she was still in her office or had taken work home, which amounts to the same thing. Margherita, she said, using the Italian form the way Enzo always had, the way everyone in Florence used it. I wasn't expecting to hear from you until next week. Things have moved faster than I expected, I said. A small pause. I see. Are you all right? I'm at the villa, I said. I came back from Rome early. Sofia left me at the airport. Another pause, longer. Left you? We were traveling together. She disagreed with my position on the property and decided to make that point in a concrete way. Francesca made a sound that was not quite a word. After 20 years of knowing her, I could hear in it exactly what she thought without her having to say it. Margherita, she said finally, do you want to wait a few days before deciding anything? Given the circumstances, no, I said. I've been waiting for 4 years. I'd like to move forward. A beat. Then, everything. Everything. I heard the sound of a pen being uncapped. Then I'll need you in the office at 9 on Thursday. There are some final documents to execute. The foundation registration requires your signature in person before it can be filed with the prefecture. Once that's done, the legal structure is complete and the property is protected regardless of what anyone else attempts. Thursday at 9, I said. In the meantime, Francesca said, I'd advise you not to respond to any legal correspondence from Damiano Russo's lawyers without calling me first. If he's moving quickly, there will be, I said. He's been planning this for at least 3 years. Then we'll be ready, she said. Get some sleep, Margherita. I put the phone down on the desk and sat for a while in the quiet study with Enzo's things around me. There was a photograph on the bookshelf, the two of us at the villa in the second summer after his mother died, standing in the olive grove, both squinting into the light. Look much younger in it than I remember feeling at the time. Enzo looks exactly as I remember him. Utterly at ease, one hand lifted to shade his eyes, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. His sister Julia had taken that photograph. We had been arguing mildly that morning, about something I cannot now remember, and we had made up before lunch, and the argument and the making up and the lunch and the photograph were all part of the same continuous good day, one of hundreds of good days at this house. I said good night to him quietly, the way I sometimes do when I am at the desk. Then I went to bed. I slept better than I had in 3 weeks. Sofia called the following morning while I was in the garden with my first coffee, deadheading the roses along the south wall, a task that had been neglected in the family's 3 weeks here, because no one else bothers with the garden in the particular attentive way it requires. My phone showed her name and I let it ring 5 times before I answered. "You didn't get on the plane," she said immediately. "No. I beat." Patricia called to ask why you hadn't arrived. Patricia, my college roommate in New York. So Sofia had called her. Or perhaps Patricia had called Sofia. It didn't matter. "I'll call Patricia," I said, "to let her know I'm fine." "Where are you?" "At the villa." Silence. I could hear something in it. Not quite surprise. More the adjustment that happens when a situation you thought you controlled reveals an unexpected dimension. "Why?" Sofia said. "Because I wanted to be here," I said. "I'll be here for a while." "Mama." Her voice had the careful, measured quality she uses when she is recalibrating. "What happened yesterday, I may have been more forceful than I intended to be. The conversation in the garden before we left, Sofia," I said gently. "I don't need an explanation." "I'm not explaining, She stopped. "I'm saying that perhaps we both said things that were harsher than necessary, under the circumstances. And I'd like us to be able to continue this conversation in a more—" "I know," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" "It means I understand what you're saying." I moved along the rose wall to a cluster of spent blooms, and worked at them with one hand while I held the phone with the other. The morning was already warm. The lavender along the path was loud with bees. "And it doesn't change my position." A longer silence. "Damiano has spoken with the lawyers again," she said. "There may be a legal avenue we haven't discussed, regarding the original transfer of the villa to Papa, and whether the family claim from his brother's line might have any standing in. That claim was settled 20 years ago," I said. "Julia signed a formal release of any competing interest in exchange for the Milan apartment. Francesca has the documentation." The silence this time had a different quality, something contracting. "You've spoken to Francesca," Sofia said. "Yes." "When?" "Last night." Another long pause. When Sofia spoke again, her voice was different. The careful measurement had gone out of it. What was left was something more stripped. "Mama, what are you doing?" "What I should have done 2 years ago," I said. "I'll be in Florence on Thursday. If you'd like to speak before that, call me. But don't call Francesca's office directly, please. There's no need for that." I hung up while she was still deciding what to say next. I finished the roses. Then I stood in the garden for a while with my coffee going cold in my hand, looking up at the property, the stone of the farmhouse going warm in the morning sun, the old wooden shutters on the upper windows that Enzo had repainted 3 summers before he died, the terrace with the stone table where we had sat through 100 evenings, the olive trees moving in a light breeze from the valley, the garden Giovanna had kept before me, and her mother before her. I thought about what Damiano had said on the terrace one of those evenings, about what a renovation into a luxury hotel would yield at peak season. I thought about the document Sofia had brought to the garden on the last morning. The lawyer's name I didn't recognize. The phrase, "all legal and commercial matters." I thought about the 12 pages in the folder, with their projected returns and their careful, consistent use of the phrase family property, as though repetition could make a legal claim out of wishful thinking. And I thought about Enzo's mother, who had looked at all of her children and made her choice clearly and without apology, and who had been right. I went back inside and made more coffee. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The week that followed was one of the strangest of my life, and also in some ways one of the most clarifying. Francesca's office on Thursday was exactly what she had described: the final documents for the foundation registration, executed with the precision and thoroughness that characterize everything she does. I signed where I was directed to sign. The notarization was witnessed by two of Francesca's colleagues. The package would be filed with the prefecture in Siena and the National Land Registry within 5 working days. After that, the foundation would be a legal fact, and the villa would be inside it, and no power of attorney and no commercial proposal and no business partner's investment timeline could touch it. Once this is registered, Francesca said, setting down her pen and looking at me across the desk, the only way the structure can be unwound is by you voluntarily while you are living. And after your death, it would require a unanimous vote of the full foundation board, which is structurally very difficult to achieve. You have built something quite solid here. Giovanna Marino would have approved, I said. Francesca smiled a small, precise smile. She was the one who first told me to always make sure the documentation was unambiguous. I drove back to the villa in the afternoon and stopped in the village for groceries. The woman at the alimentari who had been selling me cheese and cured meat for 30 years asked after my daughter, the way she always did, and I said Sofia was well and in Rome and that the children were growing fast, and she packaged my prosciutto in the particular careful way she has. On the way back to the villa, I stopped at a point on the road that has always had a view I find extraordinary: the valley below, the hill town in the middle distance, the light coming across it in the afternoon in a specific way that makes the stone buildings look as though they are lit from the inside. I got out of the car and stood there for a few minutes. I was thinking about the letter in the desk drawer, about whether to send it to Sofia or whether to wait, whether I owed her a conversation before the registration completed, whether the right thing to do was to call her and explain everything myself directly, without the mediation of a notary's document. I stood there for a while thinking about this, with the valley below me and the light doing its work on the stone. Then I got back in the car and drove to the villa, and I did not call Sofia. She called me. It was Saturday, 4 days after my meeting with Francesca, and I was in the kitchen making a slow ragu that had been Enzo's mother's recipe, a 3-hour affair that requires attention at intervals and patience in between. The kind of cooking that is also thinking. She didn't start with an apology or a reframe. She said, Damiano's lawyers have prepared a formal petition to the Italian probate court. They're arguing that Papa's original inheritance of the villa from Nana should be reviewed, because there is documentation suggesting that the transfer of the property was made under conditions that may not have fully complied with the mandatory reserved share provisions for Sofia, I said. She stopped. Tell Damiano's lawyers that the mandatory reserve question was litigated and settled in 2004. And that the judicial record is public and available at the Siena tribunal. I stirred the ragu. Tell them also that any petition they file will need to contend with the fact that the property is now held in a registered charitable foundation, which changes the legal landscape considerably. A very long silence. What? Sofia said. The foundation registration was filed on Thursday, I said. Francesca tells me it will be formally complete within the week. What foundation? Her voice had gone somewhere I hadn't heard it before: not anger, not the cold calculation of the Rome lunch or the airport corridor, but something younger and more raw. What are you talking about? There is a letter in the desk, I said. In Papa's study. Second drawer on the left. I put it there 6 months ago. It explains everything. Silence. I was going to give it to you in person, I said. But the timing changed. Mama. Her voice had fractured slightly. What have you done? I've protected the property, I said. The way Nana protected it. The way Papa protected it. The way it has always been protected by someone who understood that loving something and owning it are not the same thing. She stopped. I heard something on her end of the phone that might have been her moving through a room or sitting down or both. That's not your decision to make alone. This is our family's. It is my decision, I said. It is my property. I made it. Another long silence. Then with a quietness that was worse than shouting. I need to see that letter. I know, I said. When you're ready to come, I'll be here. She hung up. I stood at the kitchen stove and stirred the ragu and let the silence of the house settle back around me. Through the open door I could hear the afternoon birds starting up in the garden, the lavender smell coming in on the breeze. The particular sound the old house makes when the afternoon sun has warmed the stone enough to make it tick and breathe. I thought about Sofia's voice in that last moment before she hung up. The fracture in it. I had heard Sofia angry many times over the years. She has always had a temper, quick and hot like her father. I had heard her cold and calculating, as she had been in the Rome apartment, as she had been at the airport. I had heard her dismissive and imperious and wounded. I had not, in some years, heard her frightened. It was not satisfaction I felt standing at that stove. I want to be clear about that. It was closer to grief, the specific grief of understanding fully, in a moment when you can no longer pretend otherwise, how far a relationship has traveled from where it started. Sofia had been frightened not because I had done something cruel. She had been frightened because she had built a significant portion of her future plans on a foundation that turned out not to be hers to stand on. And now the ground had shifted and she could feel it. I had not built that plan for her. I had not encouraged it or validated it. But I had been too slow to dismantle it, and that was a thing I had to hold. Damiano called that afternoon, which I had expected. He did not use his careful son-in-law manner. He said in a voice that was trying to be controlled and not entirely succeeding, that what I had done was potentially in breach of various obligations that he would have his lawyers specify in writing, and that I should not assume the foundation registration was the end of the matter, and that Sofia was extremely upset. I know she is, I said. I'm sorry for that. Are you? He said. Yes, I said. Genuinely. Not for the decision but for the way she's feeling about it. That's real. He seemed unprepared for this, which told me that he had been expecting a different version of me, the one who apologized for everything, who softened and yielded, who could be made to feel guilty. Enough about Sofia's distress to reconsider. He took a moment. The lawyers will be in touch, he said, and ended the call. His lawyers sent a letter within 48 hours. It was 4 pages long and covered several arguments, most of which Francesca had anticipated. She sent me a detailed response within 24 hours and copied me on it, and I read it with the particular admiration I always feel for someone who is very good at their work. Francesca's response was calm, precise, and complete. It noted the 2004 settlement, the foundation registration, the absence of any co-ownership or co-tenancy arrangement at any point in the property's history, and concluded with a paragraph that began with the phrase, "We invite you to review the documentary record before proceeding further," in a tone that made the word invite do a great deal of work. The lawyers did not respond for 10 days. In those 10 days I lived in the villa in the most undisturbed way I had lived there in years. I was alone, which sounds like it should have been sad but was not. I worked in the garden in the mornings. I cooked properly, the way I had cooked in the years before the family visits became complicated, slow things, careful things, things that required the whole afternoon. I called my colleague in Florence and we discussed a consulting project at a museum in Verona. I called Patricia in New York and explained what had happened, and she listened in the thorough way she has without interrupting, and then said several things in the right order that I will not reproduce here but that I have thought about often since. I walked every evening. Down through the lower garden, out through the gate in the stone wall, along the track that runs through the olive grove and comes out at a point where you can see the valley in both directions. Enzo and I had walked that path thousands of times. I walked it alone now, in the long summer evenings, and it was not the same but it was not nothing. I called Giulia, Enzo's sister, who lives outside Milan and who I have remained close to since his death. I told her what had happened, the trip, the airport, the foundation. She listened without saying much until I finished, and then she said in the dry tone she shares with her brother, "Giovanna would have done exactly the same thing. She would have done it 20 years earlier, mind you. But the same thing." "I know," I said. "Enzo told me I was too patient." "Enzo was too patient himself," Giulia said. "It's a family failing. But you're a Thornton, Margherita. You have no excuse." Marco called the following Tuesday. My grandson is 11 years old and has, among other qualities, a directness that I find completely wonderful. He called my Italian number, which he knows by heart, and said without preamble, "Nana, are you okay? Mama said you didn't come to New York." "I'm at the villa," I said. "I'm very well. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said. "I'm at home." Mama and Papa have been having a lot of meetings with men in suits. A pause. About the villa, I think. Probably, I said. Is everything going to be okay? I thought about how to answer him. Marco is old enough to understand more than adults sometimes credit him with, and he is not a child who does well with being managed. The villa is fine, I said. The villa is going to be exactly as it's always been. You and Lucia will always be able to come here. What about Mama and Papa? That, I said carefully, is a conversation between the adults. But I want you to know something. Whatever is happening between the grown-ups, it has nothing to do with you. Nothing at all. He was quiet for a moment. I looked back, he said. In the airport. When we walked away. The ache again. Specific and precise. I know you did, I said. I saw you. I didn't want to walk away, he said. Papa said we had to. I know. I'm sorry, Nana. Marco, I said. You have nothing in the world to be sorry for. Do you understand me? Yes, he said, in the slightly unconvinced voice of an 11-year-old who is not entirely sure but is willing to accept the assertion for now. We talked for another 20 minutes about his football and about a film he had seen and about whether the villa still had the big spider that had lived in the corner of the cantina for 2 summers. I told him I had not checked but would report back. After I hung up, I sat for a while on the terrace in the evening, with the glass of wine I had poured at 6 and forgotten until it was warm. The fireflies were up in the olive grove, which happens in the last weeks of July, and I watched them without thinking about anything in particular. Sofia arrived on a Thursday. She came alone. I had known she would come eventually, had known it since the phone call when I had told her about the letter. She would have wanted to see the document in person, to hold it, to understand the full scope of what I had done before responding to it. Sofia has her father's need to understand the thing completely before she decides how to feel about it. It is one of the qualities I have always respected in her, even when it made arguments with her exhausting. She arrived at 10 in the morning, having driven from Rome. She looked tired in the particular way of someone who has not been sleeping well rather than someone who has been working hard. She was wearing clothes I hadn't seen before, not the polished Rome professional look she usually has, but something simpler. Jeans and a pale shirt. She looked younger than she has looked in some time and more like herself. She did not hug me when she arrived, but she also did not project the cold deliberateness of the airport. She came through the gate and looked at the house and then at me, and what I saw in her face was something I had not seen there in a long time. The letter is in the study, I said. Do you want to read it first or do you want coffee first? She almost smiled at that. Coffee first, she said. We sat in the kitchen, which was the right place to sit, the room with the morning light that was also Giovanna's room, that had always been where the women of this house had their difficult conversations because something about it made honesty easier. I made proper coffee. I set out the small biscuits that Sofia has liked since she was a child without comment, and she ate 2 of them. Then she said, "Tell me what it says." Before I read it. So I told her. Not everything at once. I went through it in the order I had written it, which was the order in which I had decided things, which was the order that made the most sense of it. The trust. The foundation. The board structure. The right of use. What it meant for the property. What it meant for her. She listened without interrupting, which cost her something. I could see it costing her. When I finished, she sat with her coffee for a while. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the garden was doing what it does in late July. The roses passed their second flush, the lavender going dry and gray at the tips, the olive trees a settled, dusty green in the late morning light. The right of use, she said finally. For us. For the children. For you, for Damiano, for Marco, for Lucia, for their children. The villa is available to you. It will always be available to you. But we can't do anything with it. You can live in it, I said. You can use it. You can love it. What you can't do is sell it or develop it or use it as collateral for a loan. She looked at the window. What if something happens to you? What if you're unable to manage the maintenance, the costs? The foundation has an endowment from a portion of the Florence apartment income. I said. Francesca structured it to be self-sustaining. The ongoing costs are provided for. You thought of everything, Sofia said. It was not entirely a compliment, but it was not entirely not one either. I tried to, I said. I had 3 months in Francesca. A small silence. Papa's desk, she said. That's where it is? The letter. Yes. Second drawer on the left. She stood up and set down her cup and walked out of the kitchen and down the corridor toward the study. I heard the door open. Then silence for a while. I stayed in the kitchen. I washed the coffee things and set them to dry. And I looked out the window at the garden and I waited. She came back after perhaps 20 minutes. She had the envelope in her hand, the letter folded back inside it. She stood in the doorway for a moment before sitting down again. You wrote this in February, she said. Yes. You'd already decided. Yes. She looked at the envelope. Why did you come on the trip? If you'd already decided, why did you come? This was the question I had expected, and I had thought about how to answer it honestly. Because you're my daughter, I said. And I wanted to see if I was wrong about what was happening. And because Marco and Lucia are my grandchildren, and I don't need a legal reason to want to spend time with them. She absorbed this. Were you wrong? She asked. About what was happening? No. I paused. I was wrong about the airport. I didn't expect that. Something moved across her face. She put the envelope on the table between us, flat, with her hand resting on it for a moment. That was she stopped. Started again. Damiano was very angry. After you refused to sign the power of attorney. He said that if you wouldn't cooperate, we should make clear that there were consequences. Making consequences clear is one thing, I said. Leaving a 68-year-old woman at an airport gate is another. I know. Her voice had gone very quiet. I know that. I waited. I was so angry, she said. I've been angry for so long. About the property, about feeling like you were keeping it from us, about she stopped. Pressed her lips together. I was angry about Papa. About the will. About the fact that he left everything to you and it felt like he left nothing to me, like I didn't count. You know that's not what it meant, I said. I know that now, she said. I think I knew it then. But knowing something and feeling it are not the same thing. And I chose to feel it the way that was most useful to me, which was as evidence that I'd always been an afterthought. This was the most honest thing Sofia had said to me in some years. I felt it the way you feel something that has been a long time coming, with a kind of heaviness and a kind of relief at once. You were never an afterthought, I said. Not to Papa and not to me. No, she said. I know. I think I've known it for a while and I've been working very hard not to. She was looking at the table. Damiano is going to keep pushing. The lawyers, let them push, I said. Francesca is excellent at what she does and the structure is sound. There is nothing to push against. Sofia was quiet for a moment. He's going to be furious, she said, when he realizes. I know. This wasn't entirely his idea, she said. I want you to know that. The project, the proposal, I wanted it too. I believed in it. I know you did, I said. That's why I didn't think of it as entirely his idea. She looked up at me then, for the first time since she'd come back from the study, a direct look, unguarded in a way that her face hadn't been all morning. I left you at the airport, she said. Yes. And you came back here. Yes. You didn't go to New York, you didn't call to argue, you didn't threaten anything. You just came back here and called Francesca. Yes. Something shifted in her expression, a recognition, slow and uncomfortable, like someone adjusting to a light that is stronger than they expected. You knew you were going to do this all along. I knew what I was going to do, I said. What changed at the airport was the timing. She sat with this. Outside, a pair of swallows were working the garden, cutting low arcs over the lavender. The sound of them, the tiny sharp cry they make, very high, came in through the open window. I need to think about some things, Sofia said. Of course you do. Can I stay? Tonight? I had not expected this, and I found that I was glad of it, genuinely, without reservation. Yes, I said. Your room is made up. I'll need to call Damiano. Use the garden if you want privacy, I said. The signal is better by the old gate. She almost smiled again, not quite, but very nearly. She stood and collected the letter and her phone and went out through the kitchen door toward the garden. I started making lunch. I made the soup Giovanna had always made in summer, a simple thing. Tomatoes from the garden and basil and good oil, served at room temperature the way they always served it in this house. I set the table in the kitchen. I cut bread. I opened a bottle of the estate's white wine, which a neighbor has been making from the grapes at the bottom of the property for 15 years under an arrangement that Enzo set up and that I had continued, because the wine is good and because the arrangement is the right kind of thing. Sofia came back from the garden after 40 minutes. She sat down at the table and looked at the soup and the bread and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He's angry." "I expected that," I said. "He thinks you've destroyed everything." "He thinks I've destroyed his plan," I said. "That's not the same thing." She looked at her soup. "He wants me to consult with the lawyers again," she said, "about whether there's any argument regarding your competency to make these decisions. Mental capacity, given your age." Francesca anticipated that. I said, "There is an independent cognitive assessment on file from a neuropsychologist in Florence, conducted in June. I had it done specifically because I knew it might come up." Sofia stared at me. I said, "fully and completely of sound mind. And I have the documentation." She stared at me for another moment, and then for the first time since she'd arrived, possibly for the first time since the Rome apartment, possibly for longer than that, she laughed. It was a short, surprised, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes before you decide to let it. "You really did think of everything," she said. "I had 3 months in Francesca," I said again. We ate the soup. We did not talk about the lawyers or the foundation or the project or Damiano. Sofia told me something Marco had said to her the previous week that was funny and characteristic and made me miss him. I told her about the swallows in the garden and the fact that they had come back for a second nesting this summer, which Enzo had always considered a good sign, because he was a rational man except on the subject of omens. After lunch she walked in the garden for a long time. I watched her from the kitchen as I washed up, moving through the paths, stopping at the rosemary hedge, standing for a while under the old fig tree that is at least 100 years old and produces no figs but provides shade in the afternoon that is so specific and pleasant that Enzo used to take his afternoon coffee there every day in summer. She stood under the fig tree for perhaps 10 minutes. I don't know exactly what she was thinking. I know what I hoped she was thinking, which was what I thought every time I stood in that garden, which was, "This is worth keeping." That evening, after dinner, a simple thing, leftover ragu with pasta, the good bread, the neighbor's wine, we sat on the terrace together and watched the fireflies come up out of the olive grove. We did not talk much. We had been talking all day and we had run through, for the moment, what could be said, and so we sat in the particular companionable way of two people who have known each other for a very long time and are in the same place and don't need to fill the space. At a certain point Sofia said, "I'm going to have to manage Damiano." "I imagine so," I said. "He's not going to let this go easily." "That may be true," I said. "But there is nothing to let go. The structure is the structure. Francesca's documentation is complete. Any legal challenge will be expensive and very unlikely to succeed, and Damiano is a practical man. When his lawyers tell him that clearly enough, he'll find something else to put his energy into." Sofia was quiet for a while. "And us," she said. I looked at my daughter, sitting in the low evening light on the terrace of the house that had belonged to Enzo's mother and was now mine and would, after my death, belong to no one in the way she had wanted it to, but would be here, intact and cared for and available, for as long as it stood. "We work it out," I said. "The way families do." "Even after the airport?" "Even after the airport," I said. "That was bad. I won't pretend it wasn't. But it was a decision made in anger, and I know the difference between a person and the worst thing they've done." She was quiet for a long time after that. The fireflies continued their work in the olive trees. Somewhere down in the valley a dog was barking at something it would never catch. The stone of the terrace was still warm from the day's sun under my feet. "Papa would have hated all of this," Sofia said. "Papa would have sorted it out 20 years ago," I said. "And then we would all have had a very long dinner together and never spoken of it again. That's not how he did things." "I know," I said. "That's why it took me 4 years." She looked at the olive grove. After a while she said, very quietly, as though the words had been waiting for some time, "I miss him." "So do I," said. "Every single day." We sat with that until the fireflies were out in their hundreds, and the valley below was dark, and the stone had finally given up its warmth for the night, and we went inside together. The following morning, before she drove back to Rome, Sofia went back to the study. She was in there for about 20 minutes, and when she came out she was holding the envelope again. "Can I keep this?" she said. "It's addressed to you," I said. She nodded. She put it in her bag. She hugged me in the way she hadn't the day before, a real hug, the kind that means something rather than signaling something. Then she got in her car and drove down the long gravel lane toward the road. And I stood at the gate and watched her go. I stood there for a while after the car had disappeared around the curve in the lane, looking down the property toward the valley. The morning was already warm. The cicadas were starting. The olive trees were silver gray in the early light and perfectly still. I thought about what came next, which would not be simple. Damiano was not going to be gracious about this. His lawyers would make more noise before they made less. There would be difficult months probably before the equilibrium settled into a new shape. Sofia and I had started something the previous evening that would take a long time to finish properly, and finishing it properly would require her to have some difficult conversations with herself about the years since Enzo's death. And that kind of conversation is never quick. And there was still the matter of the letter. The one she had taken with her in the envelope. What she would do with it, whether she would read it again, whether she would show it to Damiano, whether she would carry it in her bag for months or put it in a drawer somewhere or sit with it properly at a table someday and let it change the way she understood the last 4 years, I did not know. I would not know for some time. What I knew, standing at the gate in the morning light with the cicadas starting up in the valley below going gold, was that I had done what I could do. I had protected what I loved. I had made the thing solid enough that it could not be taken apart by anyone whose interest in it was financial rather than genuine. And I had done it while there was still time to do it, which was what Enzo had asked of me. I walked back up to the house. I had work to do, the Verona Museum project, the consulting report I had been putting off, several weeks of correspondence to catch up on. The olive harvest would start in October, and there were things to organize before then. The garden needed attention. The east wall of the outbuilding needed pointing. A job I had been meaning to schedule for 2 years. Life at the villa, in other words. The ordinary life of a woman who owned a property she loved and was not going anywhere. I made coffee. I opened the doors to the terrace. I sat at the kitchen table with the morning light coming in exactly as it had come in for 3 decades, and I thought about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, would change everything that remained for me, for Sofia, for Damiano, for the children, and for one other person I had not yet told you about, who had been watching all of this from a distance and was about to step forward in a way that none of us saw coming. But that part of the story begins somewhere else entirely. It begins with a phone call I received on a Tuesday morning in September, from a lawyer in Siena whose name I didn't recognize, who asked if I was Margaret Thornton Marino and whether I had a few minutes to discuss a matter relating to my late husband's estate. I said yes. And I sat down. The lawyer's name was Aurelio Conti, and he had a measured, unhurried voice that immediately put me in mind of Francesca, the particular register of someone accustomed to delivering information that will change the shape of a person's day. He confirmed my name and apologized for calling without warning, and then he said, "I represent the estate of Enzo Marino, specifically in relation to a secondary trust instrument executed by your husband in October of 2018. I have been holding this matter in abeyance pending the completion of certain conditions, and those conditions were met earlier this month. I would like to meet with you in person if you're available. There are documents that require your attention." I sat down at the kitchen table. October 2018 was 14 months before Enzo died. He had been diagnosed in August of that year, 3 weeks after a routine checkup. In the manner of these things, the ordinary appointment, the unremarkable test, and then the consultant's careful face and the words that divided everything into before and after. He had not told me about a secondary trust. He had not, as far as I had known until this moment, engaged a lawyer in Siena named Aurelio Conti. "How long have you been holding this?" I said. "Since March of 2020, he said. "Your husband's instructions specified that I should make contact once the primary probate of his estate was formally complete and a period of 12 months had passed. The probate completed in late 2019, and then we had the disruption of the following year, and then I confess the matter sat longer than it should have while I dealt with my own firm's reorganization, for which I apologize." "What does the trust contain?" I said. "I prefer to explain it in person," he said. There are several components and I want to make sure you understand each one clearly before we discuss the implications. I drove to Siena the following morning. Aurelio Conti's office was on the second floor of a building off the Campo, up a stone staircase that had been worn concave by centuries of feet. He was a slight man in his 60s with very precise gray hair, and the kind of hands that have spent 50 years working with documents, careful hands, ink-stained at the edges. He shook mine and gestured to a chair across from his desk and set a folder before me without preamble. "Your husband," he said, "came to see me in October of 2018. He had his diagnosis by then and he was very clear about what he wanted to accomplish and why." He paused. "He said something to me that I've thought about since." He said, "My wife has given me 30 years of her work and her life, and the legal structure of our marriage does not reflect that the way I would like. I want to correct that now while I can." I looked at the folder and did not open it immediately. "He did not want to tell you about this," Aurelio continued, "because he felt it would shift the nature of your remaining time together if you knew he was here doing this. He said you would spend the time being grateful instead of being present, and he wanted your presence more than your gratitude." That was Enzo. That was so completely Enzo that it required a moment. "What's in the folder?" I said. Aurelio opened it himself and turned it to face me. The first document was a trust instrument establishing what he called a secondary estate trust, a structure Enzo had created using proceeds from 20 years of private antique sales that had been kept in a separate business account, distinct from the main household finances. Sales I had known about generally, in the way that you know about a spouse's professional activity without tracking every transaction. Sales that Enzo had been quietly accumulating into this account since the late 1990s. The account contained 480,000 euros. I looked at the number for a moment. "He began setting this aside in 1998, Aurelio said. "Every private sale above a certain threshold, a portion went into this account. He described it to me as he checked his notes, as money that belonged to the work you did together, rather than to the business specifically. He felt that your decision to step back from your own career to support his had a financial value that was never properly recognized, and he wanted to recognize it." For years after Enzo's death, sitting in a lawyer's office in Siena with the Campo visible through the window and the September light coming in at an angle, I felt him in the room as clearly as I had ever felt him at the villa. That particular quality he had of seeing things that other people missed. The way he had kept track of things quietly over years. 34 years he had been watching. 34 years he had been paying attention. "There is a second component," Aurelio said. He turned to the next document in the folder. A separate provision within the same trust, ring-fenced from the main sum, designated specifically for the education and welfare of his grandchildren, Marco and Lucia Russo, referred to by name. The provision totaled 120,000 euros, to be held until each child reached the age of 18, at which point it would be distributed directly to them for educational purposes. The provision was explicitly structured to bypass their parents' accounts entirely. It could not be accessed by Sofia or Damiano under any circumstances. It went to the children directly when they were old enough. Enzo had done this in October 2018. Marco had been 6 years old. Lucia had been 3. Their grandfather had been dying, and he had sat in this office and made sure they would be cared for regardless of what their parents decided. "He did this before he told me about the diagnosis," I said. "He told you the same week he came to see me," Aurelio said gently. "He wanted to have this in place first." I put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the folder. The room was very quiet. From the Campo below came the ordinary sounds of Siena on a Tuesday morning: the foot traffic, the distant bell of one of the churches, a moped going past on the street below. "Was there anything else he said?" I asked. "When he was here?" Aurelio considered. "He said he hoped you would never need the trust. He said he hoped your son," he said son, referring to your son-in-law Damiano, "would prove him wrong about his own instincts." A pause. "He said his instincts about people were usually accurate, and he was sorry they were." I sat with that. Enzo had sat in this office 14 months before he died and arranged for me to be financially independent of whatever Sofia and Damiano chose to do, and arranged for his grandchildren to be educated regardless of how their parents managed money, and he had not told me because he wanted our remaining time to be present rather than grateful. I thought about what I had said to him in the last year, the ordinary things, the things you say when you are living with someone through an illness and trying to make each day complete rather than weighted. The conversations we had had about the villa, about the olive harvest he would not see, about what I should plant in the south garden in the spring, the evenings on the terrace, the mornings in the kitchen. The last walk he took through the olive grove in April of 2019, 3 months before he died, when he was still well enough to walk slowly with one hand on my arm. He had not told me about this office or this folder or this sum of money. He had let me think he was simply walking with me. "Are you all right?" Aurelio asked. "Yes," I said. And then, "No. But I will be." He gave me time. He left the room for 15 minutes on a pretext about copying documents and came back with coffee, which he set in front of me without comment. I drank it and read through the documents myself carefully, the way I read everything that matters. When I was done, I called Francesca from the staircase because the signal in the office was poor. "Francesca," I said when she answered. "Enzo set up a secondary trust in 2018. I'm sitting in a lawyer's office in Siena. There is 480,000 euros in an account I didn't know existed, and a separate provision for the grandchildren's education that goes directly to them at 18. Silence for 3 seconds. "Of course he did," Francesca said, and I could hear something in her voice that was not quite a smile but was close to one. "Enzo Marino was the most thorough man I ever worked with. I always wondered if there was something I hadn't seen." "You knew him well enough to wonder." "I knew him well enough to know he would have been thinking about all of this long before you did." Another pause. "Margarita, this is good news." "I know," I said. "It doesn't feel like good news yet. Feels like hearing from him." "Give it a day," she said. "Call me tomorrow." I drove back to the villa in the early afternoon with a copy of the trust document on the seat beside me and Schubert on the radio, the same trio I had played on the drive from Florence to Rome in the spring, on the way to the lunch where Damiano had produced his folder. The landscape was the same landscape. It was always the Crete Senesi rolling away on both sides, the light going amber over the clay hills, the cypress trees on the ridges doing what cypress trees do, which is stand straight and be exactly themselves regardless of conditions. Enzo had spent 30 years setting money aside from his best sales into an account I didn't know about so that I would be all right. I pulled over at the same point on the road where I had stopped the week before, the one with the view of the valley and the hill town. I got out of the car and stood in the road for a while. It was warm and very still. A kite was working thermals over the ridge to the east, riding without moving its wings, and I watched it until it slid behind the hill. Then I got back in the car and drove to the villa and cooked dinner and sat on the terrace until the fireflies came up, and then I went to bed. I slept again very well. Damiano's lawyers made their final move in October, 6 weeks after Sofia's visit to the villa. The letter was 14 pages long and covered 3 separate legal arguments, the most significant of which attempted to challenge the foundation registration on the grounds that I had not provided adequate notice to interested parties before establishing a structure that materially affected the value of an asset that formed part of the matrimonial estate in which Sofia held a potential inheritance interest. It was, Francesca told me, actually quite creative. It was also, she told me, going to fail. She filed a response within a week. The response was 8 pages long and addressed each argument in sequence with the particular precision that makes Francesca very good at her work. It included the complete documentation of the 2004 settlement of any competing family claims to the property. It included the notarial records confirming sole ownership at every point in the chain from Giovanna Marino to Enzo Marino to me. It included a formal legal opinion from a specialist in Italian charitable foundation law confirming that the registration had been correctly executed, and that an interested party challenge of this nature had no standing under the applicable statute. It also included, in the final section, a note informing Damiano's lawyers that I had recently come into possession of documentation from a secondary trust executed by my late husband, and that the trust's provisions included a ring-fenced educational fund for Marco and Lucia Russo that was explicitly structured to be inaccessible to either of their parents. The note expressed my hope that this information would be shared with the relevant parties, and that it would contribute to a sensible reassessment of priorities. Francesca had suggested including that last paragraph. I had approved it. Damiano's lawyers did not respond to this letter. 3 weeks later, Damiano called me directly. He did not open with pleasantries. He said, "The fund. The money Enzo left for the children. Sofia says it goes to them directly at 18. "That's correct," I said. A silence. "There's nothing we can do to access it earlier." "No," I said. "Enzo structured it that way deliberately." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but less pressurized. The voice of a man who has run his arguments through to their conclusions and found them stopping short of where he needed them to go. "How much?" 120,000 euros, I said. 60 for Marco, 60 for Lucia. Designated for educational purposes. He was quiet for a long moment. "What about the villa?" "The villa is in a registered charitable foundation," I said. "That is not going to change. And the rest of Enzo's estate, the money this lawyer is saying he kept in a separate account." "That is mine," I said. "As is everything Enzo left to me." Which was everything. The silence this time was longer than any of the others. I waited. "Sofia is going to want to see the children's fund documentation," he said. "She's welcome to contact Aurelio Conti in Siena," I said. "His details are in the letter Francesca sent." "Fine," he said. It was not an apology. It was not a concession expressed in any language that resembled graciousness. But it was Damiano Russo acknowledging, in the only way he was capable of, that the board had been swept, that the positions he had been advancing for 4 years had nowhere left to go, that his investors and their September deadline and the 12-page proposal and the power of attorney document and the lawyers and the creative 14-page challenge had all come to rest against a foundation that could not be moved, and a wife who had built it. He ended the call. I did not hear from his lawyers again. I called Sofia an hour later. I had been thinking for several weeks about how to tell her about Enzo's trust. I had thought about writing it in a letter, which is the medium I am most comfortable with for things that matter. I had thought about waiting until we were together at the villa. I had thought about having Francesca handle the communication formally, through the lawyers, which would have been efficient and would also have missed the point entirely. I called her because she was my daughter, and because what I had to tell her was not a legal matter. It was a human one. She answered on the second ring. "Is this about the lawyers?" she said. "Because Damiano told me he spoke to you this morning." "It's not about the lawyers," I said. "Not directly. I need to tell you something about Papa." A short silence. "What about him?" I told her about Aurelio Conti's call, about driving to Siena, about sitting in the office off the Campo and reading the trust document and understanding what Enzo had done and when he had done it. I told her about the main sum, the 480,000 euros accumulated from 30 years of private sales, and what he had written in the trust instrument about why he had done it. I repeated, as closely as I could, what Aurelio had told me Enzo had said in that office, that the legal structure of their marriage had not reflected what she had given him, that he had wanted to correct it while he could, that he had wanted her present rather than grateful. Sofia was quiet for so long after I finished that I thought the call had dropped. "Sofia," I said. "I'm here," she said. Her voice was different, stripped of everything, the calculation and the carefulness and the anger, all of it gone, leaving something much younger behind. "There's more," I said. I told her about the children's provision, the 60,000 euros for each of them, ring-fenced, held until they were 18, designated for education and accessible to no one before that point. Marco and Lucia, referred to by name in a document their grandfather had written when Marco was 6 and Lucia was 3. Another long silence. "He named them," she said. "By name. Both of them. He named Lucia." Her voice had fractured entirely now, not angry, not calculating, simply broken open. She was 3 years old. He was dying and he came to a lawyer's office and wrote her name in a trust. "Yes," I said. I heard her breathing, which was unsteady. "Sofia," I said. "He knew," she said. "He knew what might happen. He knew what Damiano he must have." She stopped. "He had good instincts," I said. "He always did." "I didn't know he was worried," she said. "About us. About what we might do." I thought about how to answer this honestly. "I think," I said carefully, That he loved you very much and trusted you personally, and was less certain about the decisions you and Damiano made together. He knew that money complicated things between people who loved each other, and he wanted to make sure the children were on the other side of any complication. She made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite not crying. After a moment she said, "The villa. Did he know about the foundation? Before he died?" "No," I said. "I didn't think of it until after. But I think he would have been glad." "Why?" "Because he loved it the way his mother loved it," I said. "And she kept it by making sure it couldn't be pulled apart. He would have recognized what I did." A pause. "Even though I pushed you to it." "Even though." Another silence, and then Sofia said something I had not expected. She said, "I'm sorry, Mama. For all of it. For the years of pressure and the folder and the airport. For the things I said about Papa being ashamed of you. That was..." She stopped. "That was the worst thing I've ever said to anyone." I held the phone and looked out at the garden, where the October light was doing something extraordinary to the late roses going gold and very low, the way it gets in autumn when the sun drops south and the afternoons shorten. "You were very angry," I said. "That's not an excuse." "No," I said. "But it's a reason. And I know the difference." We talked for a long time after that. Not about the lawyers or the foundation or the trust, about Enzo mostly. About specific memories. About what he had been like on ordinary days, the qualities that don't fit into eulogies but are the actual substance of a person. The way he hummed to himself when he was concentrating. The specific laugh he had for things he found genuinely funny as opposed to socially funny. The fact that he cried at films without embarrassment and never tried to hide it. Sofia told me that she had not, since his death, been able to watch the film they had watched together as a family every Christmas. A particular Italian comedy that she and Enzo had found funny in the same way. The same beats, the same lines. She said she had put it on once, 6 months after the funeral, and turned it off after 10 minutes because the absence of his laugh was too loud. I told her I understood that completely. We did not say everything that needed to be said between us. You cannot say everything in one call after years of distance. But you can start, and we started, and that was more than I had hoped for when I had dialed her number that morning. "Can I bring the children at Christmas?" she said before we finished. "Damiano, I don't know yet whether Damiano will want to come. But I'd like to bring Marco and Lucia." "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Please. And can I tell them about the fund? About what Papa did for them? When they're old enough to understand what it means," I said. "That's your judgment to make. You're their mother." A pause. "Mama," she said. And the way she said it was the way she had said it when she was small, not the adult Sofia with her Roman apartment and her polished manner, but someone much closer to the girl who had stood in this kitchen learning to make bread. "Thank you. For not letting us take it." I thought about those words for a long time afterward. Thank you for not letting us take it. She meant the villa. She meant the thing she had spent 4 years trying to acquire and I had spent 4 years protecting. But I understood, hearing it, that she also meant something larger, that she was thanking me for refusing to let the version of their family that Damiano's plans would have built, the version organized around profit and leverage and what could be extracted, become the only version. That somewhere under the years of proposals and folders and lawyers and manipulation, she had known what was being lost, and she was grateful it hadn't been. I sat with that for a long time on the terrace. Damiano withdrew entirely from the legal proceedings the following week. No announcement, no formal communication. His lawyer simply went quiet, and when Francesca followed up, she received a brief note indicating that the matter had been reviewed and her client had decided not to proceed further. The note was 2 sentences. Francesca forwarded it to me with a single line of her own. As expected. I put the note in the file with the rest of the documentation and did not think about it again. What I thought about instead, in the weeks that followed, was Enzo. Specifically, the October of 2018 that I had lived through without knowing what he was doing. I had been managing his illness. I had been the person who read the medical literature and spoke with the consultants and organized the schedules and called the family and cooked the food that he could still eat in those months, which became a narrower and narrower category as the year went on. I had been the person who sat with him in the evenings when he was too tired to talk, and who talked when he wasn't, and who learned gradually and painfully the difference between fighting something and accepting something and how to do both at once. And in October of that year, in the middle of all of that, He had driven to Siena without telling me and sat in Aurelio Conti's office and dictated a trust instrument that took care of me and our grandchildren both. I had thought I knew everything about Enzo's last year. The completeness of the time we had spent together talking, being silent, arguing about small things because large things were too large, walking when he could walk, sitting when he couldn't. I had thought there were no rooms in that year I hadn't been in. He had kept one room for himself. Not out of secrecy. Not out of any failure of intimacy. Out of love, and out of the understanding that I would experience the thing differently if I knew about it, that I would be managing his gift rather than living my own life alongside him. And that what he wanted was the life, not the management. He had always been better than me at knowing when to let things be. The olive harvest came in November, as it does. The trees on the property yield a moderate crop. This is not a commercial operation. Never has been. Just 15 acres of old trees that produce beautiful oil in quantities sufficient for the house and for gifts and for the arrangement with the neighbor who takes the surplus in exchange for the wine. I had been doing the harvest with the same local family for 20 years. A man named Johnny and his 2 sons who know the trees and bring their nets and their mechanical shaker and work through the grove in 4 days with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing a thing properly for a long time. I worked alongside them each morning. It is physical work, moving the nets, gathering what falls, managing the crates, and I am 68 years old, which means I do the parts one can do and leave the harder parts to Johnny's sons, who are 30 years younger and twice my size. But I was there every morning when they arrived, and I stayed until the light went in the afternoon. And by the end of the 4th day the whole grove had been done and the oil was at the mill and the trees were bare and ready for winter. On the last afternoon, when Johnny and his sons had loaded their equipment and driven back down the lane, I walked through the grove alone. The trees after harvest have a particular look. Stripped of their crop, the branches go spare and angular against the sky, and the light comes through differently than it does in summer when the leaves are full. In November the light is low and cold and very clear, and it makes the old trees look exactly as old as they are, gnarled and silver-barked and entirely indifferent to anything that might be happening around them. They were old when Giovanna was a child. They will be old when Marco's children are old. I stood in the grove for a while and let the cold come up from the ground through my boots. I thought about the letter in the folder. The one I had written to Sofia in February, and that she had taken with her when she left the villa in September. I thought about what she would do with it over the years, whether it would sit in a drawer, whether she would read it again, whether it would become something she returned to when things were difficult, whether someday, when Marco and Lucia were grown, she might give it to them so they could understand what had happened here. What their grandfather had built and what their grandmother had protected and what had almost been lost and was not. I thought about Enzo naming Lucia in the trust when she was 3 years old. I thought about what kind of man sits in a lawyer's office with a terminal diagnosis and thinks, the small one, the 3-year-old, she will need something that cannot be taken from her. Let me put her name on something. Christmas came and Sofia arrived with Marco and Lucia, and without Damiano, who had a prior commitment that nobody examined too closely. She sent me a message the week before they arrived saying that she and Damiano were in a period of taking some things slowly, and I replied that I understood and that the beds would be made. They arrived on the 23rd in the late afternoon, just before the winter dark came down. Marco had grown several centimeters since July and was at the age where height changes monthly. Lucia ran through the house ahead of everyone else, claiming rooms and calling out to her brother about things she had remembered from the last visit. The spider in the cantina, the fig tree, whether the pool was covered or open. Sofia came through the door last and stood for a moment in the entrance, looking at the house around her. I watched her look at it. Not with the appraising eye of the planning conversations. Not with the careful manner of the Rome lunch or the folders. Just looking the way you look at something you have missed and are relieved to find unchanged. It's the same, she said. It's always the same, I said. That's the point. She came into the kitchen and helped me cook. We made Giovanna's pasta together. Side by side at the counter the way we had in July, flour on both our forearms, and this time the silence between us was a different kind, lighter, less freighted, something that had begun slowly to mean ease rather than avoidance. Marco helped set the table without being asked, which Enzo would have noticed and approved of. Lucia told me about her school and her friends and a painting she had done that her teacher had praised. We ate the pasta and drank the neighbor's wine, and the children had a little watered, the way Italian children are given wine at family dinners when the occasion is right, and we talked about ordinary things for 3 hours. After the children went to bed, Sofia and I sat on the terrace with our wine, which was cold but not impossibly so. The winter sky over the valley was extraordinary, the kind of clarity that comes in the hills in December, when there is no humidity and no light pollution and the stars are as close as they ever get. Damiano and I are not doing well, Sofia said. I know, I said. I've been thinking a great deal about what Papa did, about why he set up the trust the way he did. And I've been thinking about the 4 years since he died and the choices I made in them. She looked at the sky. I chose badly. I didn't offer a disagreement or a comfort. She was right and she knew she was right and she was working her way through it in her own order. I don't know what happens next, she said. With Damiano, with the business, with she stopped. With everything. You don't need to know yet, I said. When did you know? That you had to act, that you had to stop waiting and do something? I thought about the airport gate. The departure board still showing boarding. My boarding pass in my hand, Sofia's back in the crowd going away from me. At the airport, I said. When you walked away. She absorbed this. I did you a favor. In a sense, I said. I had been ready for months. You just moved the timeline. I was so certain you would call, she said. That night or the next morning. I kept checking my phone. I know. And instead you changed your flight and went back to the villa and called Francesca. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know if I could have done that. If I were in your position. You might be surprised, I said. People are capable of more than they think when the moment actually comes. She looked at the stars for a while. Then she said, I'm going to be a different kind of mother to Marco and Lucia. I've been thinking about that too. About what I want them to learn from all of this, about what I want them to see. What do you want them to see? That things are worth more than what you can get for them, she said. And then after a pause, I think Papa was trying to teach me that my whole life. I just wasn't listening. I did not say anything. She had said it herself in her own words in her own time. That was how it needed to happen. The stars moved through their arc above the valley and the house was warm behind us and the olive trees were dark and bare at the edge of the garden and we sat together on the terrace in the cold December night until the wine was done. And then we went inside. I am writing this from the desk in Enzo's study, on a February morning 3 years after the airport. The light through the east window is the winter light, low and pale blue, very clean. The olive grove is dormant. The garden is waiting for spring. Sofia and Damiano separated quietly in the spring following Christmas, and she has been managing the practical aftermath of it with more composure than I would have expected from her 2 years ago, and exactly the composure I would expect from her now. She is living in Florence, in a smaller apartment than the Rome one, and she has taken a position at a cultural foundation that works with historic properties across the region. The work suits her. She is very good at it. She comes to the villa often. She brings the children when she can, and sometimes she comes alone, and when she comes alone she works in the garden or helps with whatever the house needs, and sometimes she sits in the study while I work at the desk reading without any need for conversation. Damiano took his investors and his proposals and his legal folder somewhere else, to other properties and other opportunities, as men like Damiano always do. He remains in the children's lives because he is their father and he loves them, and I believe that is true even of people who have done things you cannot forgive easily. Marco is 14 now. He has started asking questions about the villa's history, when the farmhouse was built, which parts of the garden are original, how the olive trees are managed and why. He wants to understand how things work. He has, of all Enzo's qualities, inherited the ability to look at something old and understand it, to see what it was before it was what it is. I have started teaching him about the property's conservation needs, the way I might have taught him about a painting's condition. You learn the surface before you touch it. You understand what is there before you decide what it needs. Lucia has decided she wants to be a botanist. She has been growing things in pots on the Florence apartment windowsill, and keeping a journal of their progress. She comes to the villa and goes directly to the garden, cataloging what she finds, asking questions I can only partly answer about the plants that have been here longer than any of us. She has Enzo's precision. She will do very well. The educational fund their grandfather left them sits in Aurelio Conti's care, accumulating quietly, waiting for the year they each turn 18. 60,000 euros each, Put there by a man who died before they were old enough to understand what it meant that he thought of them. They know it exists. I told them myself at Christmas 2 years ago, on the terrace with Sofia present, in language that a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old could understand. Marco had been very quiet for a while after I explained it. Then he said, "He did this when I was 6? When you were 6, I said. And Lucia was 3. He knew he was dying? He had just found out." Marco looked at the olive grove for a long time. "He still thought about us," he said. "Not a question. A recognition." "He always thought about you," I said. "Both of you. The foundation registration has been complete for 3 years. The villa is inside it, cared for intact. The olive harvest comes and goes each November. The neighbor makes the wine. The garden does what gardens do, which is persist and change and persist again. The east wall of the outbuilding got repointed last spring, finally, and Johnny's eldest son did it well. I have been asked since this story became known to some people outside the family, what I would say to someone in the position I was in 4 years ago, someone being pushed, being pressured, being asked to give away what was genuinely theirs by people who had convinced themselves that love gave them the right to take it. I think what I would say is this. Enzo taught me over 34 years that caring for something and owning it are different activities. You can love a place without needing to put your name on it. You can love a person without needing to extract from them. He lived that way completely and entirely, and it was the most instructive thing I ever witnessed, and I am still learning from it. I would also say, keep your documentation in order. Have a good notary. And if someone tells you that holding to what is right means choosing money over family, understand that they have misidentified both things. The money was never the point. The money was just what they wanted. The point was the desk in the study, and the walk through the olive grove in November, and the light in the kitchen in the afternoon that Giovanna loved and Enzo loved and I have loved for 30 years and that Marco is beginning, I think, to understand. The point was the thing worth keeping. Spring came to the villa the way it always does in Tuscany, not suddenly, not dramatically, but by degrees. The almond tree in the south garden went first in February, its white flowers appearing on bare branches in a way that always seems improbable after winter. Then the forsythia along the old wall. Then the grass beginning to green in the lower terraces, and the first of the wild herbs pushing through the stone joints in the path, and the swallows returning to the eaves above the kitchen door in April, precise as a calendar. I had spent the winter working. The Verona Museum consulting project had grown into something more involved than I had expected. A significant tempera panel had been discovered during routine storage reorganization, its condition far better than the century of neglect around it might have suggested, and the museum's conservation team had asked if I would oversee the treatment assessment. I drove up twice in March, stayed 3 days each time, worked alongside a conservator 20 years younger than me who had a technical education I recognized and instincts I found genuinely interesting. We argued productively about the treatment approach and arrived at something neither of us would have reached alone, which is the best possible outcome of a collaboration. I came back to the villa in April with the feeling of someone returning to their own air after a long time breathing someone else's. The drive south from Verona through the spring landscape, the Apennines still showing snow on the high ridges while the valley floors were already green, is one of those drives that reminds you the world is very large and very old and fundamentally indifferent to your particular problems, which is precisely the reminder I find most useful. Julia called on my second evening back, as she often does when she knows I have returned from somewhere. She has a quality of attention, Enzo's sister, that I find both flattering and somewhat unnerving, the ability to know, without being told, when you need to be called and approximately what you need to hear. "How was Verona?" she asked. "Good," I said. "The panel is extraordinary. 15th century, probably Umbrian, very intact beneath the surface dirt. The young conservator is excellent. And the villa? The garden needs a week of my attention, and the fig tree has a dead branch that needs to come off before it falls on something. Otherwise it's fine. It's always fine." Julia made a sound that meant she approved of this. "Damiano's business," she said, transitioning without preamble in the way she has. "Did Sofia tell you?" "Something," I said. "She mentioned difficulties last month." I didn't press for details. The investors he was courting for the Tuscan development, not just our villa. He had several other properties lined up for the same kind of scheme. They pulled out completely in January. Apparently, an investigation opened in Milan into the way one of the investment funds was structured. Nothing proven yet, but the exposure was enough. The whole project collapsed. I said nothing for a moment. I mention it, Julia continued, not because I think you'll feel satisfaction about it, but because Sofia is going to need you to be unsurprised when she talks about the practical implications. The apartment in Rome is likely to be sold. Damiano has liabilities she didn't know about. How is she? Calmer than you'd expect, Julia said. I think she was braced for it. I think if I'm honest, she saw it coming well before she was willing to admit she saw it. You know how that works. I did know how that worked. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen with the doors open to the terrace, listening to the spring evening, the nightjars in the valley, the last light going out of the sky to the west. I was not glad about what was happening to Damiano. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to misread the feeling I had sitting there, which was more complex than satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling you have when something you could see from a distance finally arrives at the place you were watching from, and the arrival is neither surprising nor pleasant, just real. Damiano had built something on a foundation he didn't own, and when the foundation was gone there was nothing for the structure to stand on. That was not a punishment I had arranged. It was a consequence he had built himself over years, one leveraged proposal at a time. I opened the kitchen doors wider and let the evening in, and I thought about Sofia, not the Sofia who had walked away from me at the airport, but the one who had stood under the fig tree in October and the one who had sat at this table in December and said she wanted to be a different kind of mother, and I thought that she was going to be all right. Marco arrived alone in May. He was 16 by then, and the height change since Christmas had continued at the rate that makes mothers and grandmothers feel the passage of time most sharply. He came on the train from Florence, where he had been visiting Sofia, carrying a backpack and a battered copy of a book about the ecology of the Mediterranean that he had apparently been reading for 2 months without finishing because it kept leading him to other books. He did not ask about his father. He did not ask about the legal history or the trust or any of the things that had shaped the previous 3 years. He put his bag in his room, came to the kitchen, ate most of a frittata I had made and said, "Can I help with the garden this week?" "Yes," I said. "There's a lot to do." We worked through the week in the companionable way that outdoor work produces between people who like each other and don't need to fill silence. Marco had grown into his hands. They were Enzo's hands, large and careful, the kind that do precise work without being told to. He was thorough in the garden, moving through tasks with a methodical attention that reminded me of his grandfather working on a restoration, or on the olive grove after his mother's death, the same quality of giving a thing your full concentration without performing the giving. On the third morning, pulling up the winter-dead growth along the south border, he found something in the dry mulch beneath the lavender hedge. He held it up. A small glass bottle, dark green with a rusted metal stopper. "Empty." "Old," he said. "Very," I agreed. "The gardens here have been accumulating layers for centuries. You find things occasionally." He turned it in his fingers. "How do you know when something is worth keeping?" I looked at him. He was not asking about the bottle. He had the directness his mother lacked and his grandfather had had in abundance, and he was 16 years old and thinking about something. "You're asking about the property," I said. "I'm asking generally," he said. "But yes, about all of it. The villa, the foundation, what Nano did. Why some things get kept and some things get sold." I sat back on my heels and looked at the garden, the old walls and the new growth and the lavender coming into its first purple of the season. "Your great-grandmother," I said, "kept this property by choosing the person who would care for it over the person who expected it. That was a distinction she understood very clearly. Caring for something means understanding what it is and working to preserve that. Expecting something means understanding what it's worth and wanting the value. Nano understood that. Completely. And you do." "I've tried to," I said. "I learned it from watching the two of them." Marco turned the bottle again. "I want to learn about the history of the property," he said. "The actual history. How old the different parts of the house are, when things were built. I've been reading about agricultural history in this region and I want to understand how this place fits into it." I looked at him. "Your grandfather had documents," I said slowly. "Research he had done on the property's history over the years. I haven't gone through it all. Some of it is in boxes in the cantina." Marco looked at the cantina door across the garden. "After lunch," he said. The cantina at the villa is a long, low room running under the east side of the house, stone-vaulted, cool even in summer, that has served over the centuries as storage for everything the house produced and needed. Enzo had converted one section into a small wine cellar, and another into organized shelving for tools and equipment. A third section, which we reached through a low wooden door at the far end, was the room where things had accumulated over generations without ever being properly sorted. We spent 2 afternoons in there. Marco was systematic about it in a way I found both useful and, at moments, moving. He had brought a notebook and was cataloging as we went, logging what appeared to be what and noting condition. Old farm implements, bottles, ceramics, a set of ledgers from what appeared to be the 1920s, the ink still legible, recording harvests and accounts in a hand that was almost certainly Enzo's grandmother's. On the second afternoon he found a wooden box under a shelf near the back wall. It was not a large box, perhaps 40 centimeters long, 20 wide, sealed with a simple metal clasp that had rusted shut. The wood was old but sound. When he brought it out into better light we could see that someone had written on the lid in black ink in Italian in handwriting I recognized. Research notes, property history. M. Enzo's initials. Marco looked at the box and then at me. "When do you think he put it here?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "He worked on the property's history on and off for years. I knew he had notes somewhere. I never looked for them after he died." We brought the box up to the study. The clasp required some work with a small tool before it gave, and when it opened the smell that came from it was the particular smell of old paper and time, a smell I know professionally and personally, the smell of things that have been kept because someone decided they were worth keeping. Inside were 3 notebooks and a collection of loose papers and photographs, held together with a deteriorating rubber band that broke when Marco carefully lifted them. The notebooks were filled with Enzo's handwriting, dense, precise, the writing of someone working something out rather than recording it for an audience. The loose papers included what appeared to be photocopies from municipal archives, extracts from historical records, a hand-drawn map of the property showing boundaries that were slightly different from the current ones and annotated with dates. The photographs were what stopped both of us. They were old photographs, some very old, printed on a thick cardstock that dated them to the late 19th or early 20th century. Photographs of the property, of the house, of the garden and the olive grove. People standing in front of the farmhouse in the clothes of their era. A woman at the kitchen garden, photographed from behind, who might have been any woman of that time but who stood with a particularity of posture that struck me. Enzo had written on the back of several of them, in pencil, the names and dates he had identified from family records. The woman in the kitchen garden was identified as Maria Lucia Ferrante Marino, 1887, which was Enzo's great-grandmother. The first Marino woman who had owned the property, as opposed to living on it as part of a husband's estate. The first one whose name appeared on the deed. Marco looked at this photograph for a long time. "She looks like she belongs there," he said. "She does," I said. "Like you do." I looked at the photograph again. Maria Lucia Ferrante Marino, 1887, standing in her kitchen garden with her back to the camera, in a dress that had probably been practical and was probably uncomfortable, doing what she always did. Unknowing of the photograph. Unknowing that a great-great-grandson would sit in her farmhouse 137 years later and recognize the way she stood. We spent the evening going through the notebooks. Enzo's research was thorough in the way his work always was. He had traced the property back through municipal land records to the 16th century, which was as far as the surviving documentation went, and he had assembled a picture of the generations of families who had farmed and managed and lived on these 15 acres and this house across that span of time. Most of the names meant nothing to either of us, but the pattern they made, the continuous thread of care and maintenance and passing on, was something. Marco read in silence for a long time. He read the way his grandfather had read, which is to say with his whole attention. At a certain point he said, he was trying to understand the obligation. I looked up from the photograph I had been examining. "He's written it here," Marco said, and turned the notebook toward me. Near the bottom of a page that had been working through the property's history in the 1700s, Enzo had written in the margin, in a smaller hand than the main text separate from the research, clearly a personal note. What does the property ask of the person who holds it? I think this is the question Mama understood. It asks continuity. It asks that you hold it lightly enough to pass it on. I read it twice. He wrote that, Marco said. And then he left it in a box in the cantina. Some things are for yourself, I said. Not for an audience. Marco closed the notebook carefully. He sat with it in his hands for a moment. He had the look he gets when he is arriving at something he doesn't have words for yet, a quality of internal processing that is entirely his grandfather's. I want to study this, he said. The history of the property. Properly. Not just for myself. I want to document it. The notebooks are here, I said. The archival records can be accessed. Aurelio Conti might know where additional historical documentation is held in the local archives. I mean more than that, he said. I mean that when I'm older I don't know exactly how yet, I want the history of this place to be properly recorded and preserved, so that whoever comes after us understands what it is they're holding. He was 16 years old, sitting in his grandfather's study with his grandfather's notebook in his hands, talking about whoever comes after us, and I found that I could not speak for a moment. Enzo had been right about the eye. He had been right about a great deal. Lucia called that evening from Florence, having heard from Marco that they had been in the cantina. She wanted to know immediately about the garden in the old photographs, specifically whether any of the plantings visible in the 19th century images matched what was currently in the garden, and whether there was any documentation of what the kitchen garden had historically grown. I told her the notebooks made several references to specific plants but that a proper analysis would require the kind of botanical knowledge I didn't have. She told me she was working on it. Lucia at 13 had the focus quality of someone who knows exactly what kind of mind they have and is already learning how to use it. Her botanical journal had evolved from windowsill pots in Florence into a systematic record of plants she observed and researched, cross-referenced with historical accounts of the region's agricultural heritage. Her science teacher had told Sofia last year that Lucia was the most methodical student he had taught in 20 years, which was the kind of comment that would have made Enzo quietly proud, and would have made him say nothing about it until an appropriate time. Sofia came to the villa in June, 2 weeks after Marco's visit. She came alone as she had been doing, and she looked different from the December visit, lighter in the way that people look when they have put down something very heavy and their body is still. Surprised by the absence of it. The Rome apartment had been sold. She was settled in Florence and the transition, she said, was going better than she had expected. The foundation work was absorbing. She had met people in that work, conservators, historians, property specialists who she found genuinely interesting in a way she hadn't felt about her professional contacts in years. We were in the kitchen the evening of her first day. She was washing vegetables, I was at the stove. The ordinary domestic ease that the kitchen at this villa has always produced. Marco told me about the box, she said. Papa's research notebooks. We spent 2 evenings going through them, I said. He was very thorough. He had traced the property back to the 16th century. Marco wants to continue it. He told me on the phone. He wants to do a proper historical documentation. I know. He talked about it seriously. Sofia was quiet for a moment, washing the tomatoes with the careful attention she brings to kitchen tasks. He's very like him, she said. In certain ways. The precision. The patience. Not just that, she said. The sense of what matters. She set down the tomatoes and turned to me. I've been thinking about what Papa wrote in the margin. What Marco told me about it. That the property asks that you hold it lightly enough to pass it on. I waited. I thought for years that I was supposed to own it, she said. That inheriting it was the point. And I understand now that Papa was never trying to give me the property. He was trying to give me the relationship to it. The way you have it. The way Nana Giovanna had it. She paused. I missed that entirely. You understand it now, I said. I think I started to understand it when I read your letter, she said. The one from the desk. I've read it several times since I took it. The part where you say that loving something and owning it are not the same thing. I've thought about that more than anything else in the last 2 years. I turned back to the stove. You wrote that to me, she said. Not to a lawyer. Not in a legal document. To me. Yes, I said. It was always for you. She picked up the tomatoes again and brought them to the counter beside me, and we cooked in silence for a while in the kitchen where her grandmother and her great-grandmother had cooked. in the light that came in from the west in the evening in a particular gold way that is the light of this room and always has been. July brought a development that none of us had anticipated, and that managed to be both small and significant in the way that the best developments are. A woman came to the door on a Tuesday morning, not a stranger exactly, but not someone I knew well. Marta Serafini, the granddaughter of the neighbor whose family had farmed the land below the villa's southern boundary for 3 generations, and who had been involved in a long-running boundary dispute with Enzo's brother back in the 90s, a dispute that had been officially resolved but that had left a residue of awkwardness for 20 years. She was in her 30s with the particular directness of someone who has decided to do a thing and is going to do it regardless of how it goes. She said she had been thinking about coming to see me for a year, and that she was sorry it had taken this long, and she had brought a jar of their family's honey, which she held out with the self-consciousness of someone who is not certain the gesture is adequate. I took the honey and thanked her and asked her in for coffee. She wanted to know, she said, whether I would consider a cooperative arrangement between the villa's olive production and her family's operation. Her grandfather had spoken about such an arrangement with Enzo years before the boundary dispute had complicated things, and it had never happened, and she thought it was something worth revisiting. The Serafini family had a small mill of their own and the infrastructure for small-batch premium oil production, and the villa's old variety trees produced a fruit that was, in her considered opinion, exceptional in a way that the current arrangement with Johnny's harvesting and the municipal mill was not fully capturing. I listened to her. She spoke about olive oil the way conservators speak about pigments, with a specific vocabulary and a genuine feeling for the quality of the thing, the distinctions that matter and why they matter. We talked for 2 hours. I told her I would think about it. She left the honey on the kitchen table and drove back down the lane, and I stood at the window watching her go and thought about Enzo's brother's boundary dispute, and about the 20 years of awkwardness, and about the fact that here was someone wanting to build something from the connection rather than extract from it. I called Marta the following week and said yes. The arrangement we made was simple and equitable. The villa's olives would go to the Serafini mill rather than the municipal one. Marta's family would handle the pressing and bottling, and would produce a small batch oil under a label that referenced both the Serafini name and the property's historical designation. The revenue would be split proportionally. The cooperation would be reviewed annually, and could be ended by either party without penalty. When I told Sofia about it on the phone, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Papa would have done that 20 years ago." "I know," I said. "I should have done it 15 years ago. But the timing has to be right." Johnny, the man who had been doing the harvest for 20 years, was 63 and had been saying for 2 years that his back was making the work increasingly difficult. The new arrangement meant his role became coordination rather than physical labor, which suited him. He took it as a natural evolution and expressed no objection, which told me his complaints about his back had been genuine. The first harvest under the new arrangement came in November, as harvests do. Marta brought 2 of her cousins to help with the picking alongside Johnny and his sons, and there was the particular atmosphere of a working collaboration finding its rhythm, people learning how to work together, the small negotiations of method and pace that happen when different ways of doing things have to meet. By the second day it was running smoothly. By the 4th day, which was the last, it felt established. The oil that came from the press in December was extraordinary. Marta sent me a bottle before the rest of the production was labeled, with a note that said, "This is what your trees have been producing all along. We just needed the right process." I put the bottle on the kitchen windowsill where the afternoon light fell on it and made it glow green gold, and I left it there for several days before I opened it. Christmas that year was the fullest the villa had been since before Enzo's illness. Sofia and the children as planned. Julia came from Milan with her partner, a quiet architect she had been with for 8 years, and who understood instinctively that the way to be welcome in a place is to pay attention to it. Aurelio Conti came for drinks on the 24th, which was an unusual development but one that had emerged naturally from the months of contact and which felt right. He brought his wife, who knew the region's history as well as he did, and immediately entered into conversation with Marco about the 16th century land records that had shown an earlier version of the property boundary. Marta Serafini came with her grandfather on the afternoon of the 26th. The old man was in his 80s and moved slowly but had the eyes of someone whose internal life was still entirely active. He sat at the kitchen table and I brought out the olive oil and bread and the good salt, And he tasted the oil and nodded once in the way of someone whose assessment is not something they give away cheaply. This is what the Grove was always capable of, he said. My father told me, before the dispute with the family, that the Marino trees were the oldest in the valley. Enzo always believed that, I said. The old man looked at me directly. Your husband was a good man. The dispute was not his doing. These things happen between families and they go on longer than they should. I know, I said. He picked up the bread again and ate in silence for a moment. It's good that this is happening now, he said, meaning the cooperative arrangement, meaning the oil, meaning something broader. It should have happened a long time ago. On the evening of the 27th, after Julia and her partner had gone to bed and the children were upstairs with their devices and whatever young people do with the last quiet hours of a holiday, Sofia and I sat on the terrace. It was cold, genuinely cold, the kind of clear winter cold that Tuscany gets in the deep part of December when the air comes down from the north and the stars are very sharp and very close. We had blankets. We had the last of the neighbor's wine, which was almost gone from the cellar and would be replenished in spring. Next year, Sofia said. I want to bring Lucia here in April. She wants to do a survey of the garden's historical plantings. She's written to a botanical historian in Siena, who has agreed to advise her on methodology. She's 13, I said. I know, Sofia said, with the particular pride and bewilderment of a mother watching a child become specifically themselves. She's written a formal email to a professional in her field. Enzo would have handled the correspondence for her, and then made sure she did it herself next time, I said. Sofia laughed a real laugh, warm and unguarded. It was the laugh she had had as a child, before the adult versions took over. We were quiet for a while. The valley below was dark and completely still. In the olive grove the bare branches held their winter shapes against the sky. I think about the airport sometimes, Sofia said. So do I said. Not with regret exactly. More with, she thought for a moment, with a strange kind of gratitude that it happened, that it was a clear moment, that everything got defined. Moments like that are useful, I said, even when they're terrible. I was so certain I was right, she said, about what the property should be, about what you were doing by refusing. I had built such a complete case in my mind, the numbers, the projections, what it would mean for the children's futures. I genuinely believed it. I know you did. What made you sure? She said. That you were right. How did you hold to it? I looked at the olive grove. The answer to this question was one I had been finding my way toward for 3 years, and I thought I had most of it now. Your grandmother knew what she was doing when she left this property to Papa, I said. She had looked at all her children and she had chosen the one who would care for it. Not because the others didn't love it. Because of what kind of love they had for it. I paused. When you love something the way she loved it and Papa loved it, and the way I have tried to love it, you know what it needs from you. And what it needs is not to be treated as a means to something else. It needs to be the thing itself. The end, not the instrument. Sofia was quiet for a long time. The foundation, she said eventually. The trust. What happens to all of it when you're gone? The board will govern the foundation, I said. The property will continue to be maintained, and used the way it always has been. You and the children and their children have the right of use. The clause I wrote is permanent. Marco's research will be part of the archive I hope to establish in the next few years, if Aurelio can help me structure it properly. The oil production continues with Marta's family as long as both sides choose it. And what about us? She said. The family. Not legally. Just us. I thought about the question. About Julia asleep upstairs and Marco reading in his room with his botanical ecology book and Lucia's survey plans and Marta's grandfather at the kitchen table tasting the oil and nodding his austere approval. The family, I said, is already in better shape than it was 3 years ago. That's not an accident. Sofia pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked up at the winter stars. No, she said. It isn't. We sat there until the cold drove us in, and then we went inside and closed the doors, and the villa settled into its winter quiet around us, as it has been doing for 500 years, holding everything it has been asked to hold. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.